All right, today we need to talk about something that's pretty tough, but honestly, it's so important. We're diving into the dark history of human experimentation. Yeah, it's a story where the drive for scientific progress crashes head on with basic human rights, and it forces us to ask some really uncomfortable questions.
And really, it all boils down to this one question, doesn't it? How far is too far for the sake of science? At what point does that search for a breakthrough, for a cure, cross a line that you just can't uncross? Let's get into it.
Okay, so here's our roadmap. We're going to start with the why, the so-called noble causes behind these studies. Then we'll look at who the victims were, what went down when the truth came out, the almost total lack of consequences, and finally, the good that came from all this horror, the ethical rules we rely on today. So, first up, a noble cause. To really understand how any of this could have happened, you've got to look at the motivation. And it's not always, a mustache-twirling villain. A lot of the time, it started with a desperate search for answers, like finding a cure for a terrible disease, like hepatitis, or figuring out how to stop criminal behavior. It's that classic trap, right? The ends justifying the means, but taken to a place that is just unbelievably dark. After the absolute atrocities of World War II, the world said never again and created rules like the Nuremberg Code. A bit later, in 1964, came the Declaration of Helsinki. It built on all that good stuff, but it had this one tiny little clause. It said that a legal guardian could give consent if a person couldn't give it themselves. Now that sounds reasonable, right? A way to protect people? But that clause, oh man, it became a massive, glaring loophole. And boom, here's exactly how that loophole got exploited. Enter Dr. Saul Krugman at the infamous Willowbrook State School. He went to parents who were absolutely desperate, and basically said, look, this place is so filthy, your kid's probably going to get hepatitis anyway. But if you let me experiment on them, I can get them into a cleaner ward and maybe, just maybe, we'll find a vaccine. Can you even imagine that? For parents who felt like they had no other choice, it was a truly impossible situation. All right, our next section, the most vulnerable subjects. And this is where a really disturbing pattern starts to emerge. Think about it. Who were the subjects of these experiments? It was never the rich, never the powerful. No. There was a horrifying logic to it all. They always went after the people who couldn't fight back, the ones who had no voice to say no. Let's start with Willowbrook. This place, it wasn't even a school. It was more like a warehouse for humans. It was horrifically underfunded, dangerously overcrowded. And here, children with intellectual disabilities were deliberately, systematically infected with hepatitis. They were either injected with the live virus or, and this is just awful, they were fed extracts from infected poop that was mixed into their chocolate milk. Now look at this number, 1,200. What is that? It's the estimated number of calories per day that children in some Canadian residential schools were fed. I mean, that's a starvation diet. It's less than what many people eat for lunch and dinner combined. And this horrific manufactured malnutrition, well, it created what some researchers saw as a perfect opportunity. So up in Canada, in the 40s and 50s, government nutritionists looked at these starving Indigenous children, and instead of seeing a crisis that they needed to fix, they saw a research project. I'm not kidding. For years, they used more than 1,000 kids as human guinea pigs. They'd give some kids vitamin supplements, some got nothing, and they just watched. They coldly studied the effects of a disaster that they themselves were creating and allowing to happen. And this pattern isn't just ancient history. Think about the Bhopal gas leak in India in 1984, an absolute catastrophe. Years later, a new hospital opened, promising free treatment for the survivors. But that promise of help? It was a complete and total betrayal. For about 4 years, hundreds of these victims, people desperate for any kind of relief, were signed up for clinical drug trials by huge pharmaceutical companies, often with zero clue what they were actually agreeing to. Then you have places like America's prisons. At San Quentin, the chief surgeon, a guy named Dr. Leo Stanley, basically had absolute power over the inmates for decades. He was a huge believer in eugenics and performed almost 1,000 sterilizations. And get this, he did these completely bizarre experiments where he'd transplant testicles from animals into prisoners, all because he thought it could cure them of being criminals. It's just wild. Okay, so for decades, all of this stuff was happening in the shadows. But secrets like these, they can't stay buried forever. Eventually, the truth starts to claw its way out, and when it does, it's explosive. This section is all about that exposure and the public outrage that followed. And the backlash didn't just come from the public. It came from inside the medical community itself.
Just listen to this quote about the Willowbrook study from Maurice Hilleman, a legendary vaccinologist, basically a titan in the field. He called it the most unethical medical experiment ever performed on children in the United States. I mean, when one of your own peers, a giant in the industry, says that, you know you've crossed a serious, serious line. Sometimes people have to see something to really believe it. There had been whispers and reports about Willowbrook, but in 1972, a young reporter named Geraldo Rivera went inside with a camera crew. His raw, televised exposé it blew the doors off the whole thing. For the first time, people saw the horrific conditions, the neglected children living in filth. It shocked the nation to its core and created a public outcry that nobody could ignore anymore.
So the public is outraged. But here's the thing. Outrage and justice are two very different things. And this next part, justice denied, is maybe the most frustrating part of this whole story, because almost none of the people who did these things ever really paid a price for it. There was just no accountability. Just look at the comparison here. It's night and day. On one side, you have the researchers. Dr. Krugman, he went on to become the president of the American Pediatric Society. The doctors in Canada had successful careers. Dr. Stanley, he just retired peacefully. And the victims? Well, they were left with a lifetime of health problems, got little or no money, and had their stories completely buried for decades. The injustice is just staggering. And I want you to really let this one sink in. The Canadian nutrition studies, they were a secret until 2013. 2013. That's 60 years after they ended. 60 years. It took a historian, Dr. Ian Mosby, digging through archives to even find them. By then, of course, the researchers were long gone. Generations of victims had lived their entire lives and passed away without anyone ever knowing their story, let alone getting any justice. But it's not all darkness. Out of all of this horror and suffering, something good was eventually forged. A hard-won legacy, for sure. The public shock from these scandals directly, and I mean directly, led to the ethical protections that are in place for research subjects right now. You can literally draw a straight line on this timeline. In 1964, you have the Helsinki Declaration with its loophole. Then in 72, bam, the Willowbrook story explodes on TV. That, along with the exposure of the Tuskegee syphilis study, created a massive political firestorm. And look, just 2 years later, in 1974, the U.S. passes the National Research Act. It was a direct response, a promise to make sure this kind of thing could never happen again.
And here is the absolute key takeaway. The most important thing to come out of all this is something called an Institutional Review Board, or an IRB. Thanks to that National Research Act, it is now the law that any federally funded research on people must be reviewed and approved by an independent ethics committee first. It's a firewall that was built directly from the bricks of these tragedies.
So that brings us full circle, right back to that big question, but with a modern spin. We have built these safeguards, these ethical walls, to protect people. But science doesn't stand still. With gene editing, AI, all kinds of new frontiers, new ethical questions are popping up every single day. So the question for us now is, are those walls we built strong enough? Are they high enough to stop the abuses of the future? Honestly, that's a question we should never, ever stop asking.